I'm Clyde, and I'm really glad you're here with me tonight. Before we settle into this very slow and very cozy Winter Solstice adventure, I want to remind you that I have an entire playlist filled with all my boring travels. Sleepy stories from every corner of history. If you want a gentle wander through time while you drift off, you can find them all there waiting for you. And it might be a good moment to tap the like button and subscribe so you don't forget once your eyes get heavy. It happens to me all the time. I get sleepy, and suddenly, even simple things feel like they take 3 centuries, so this might be the best time to do that. And if you want even more coziness, becoming a channel member supports the channel and lets you get a personalized, sleepy story from me. Something just for you, slow, calm, and admittedly rather uneventful. My specialty. All right, let's step into the story now. I found myself standing just outside a long, wooden hall somewhere in the northern reaches. The kind of place where winter seems to settle into your bones, but somehow in a pleasant, almost polite way. The air had that crisp, slightly icy smell, like snow resting on pine branches nearby. I could see warm orange light spilling through the gaps in the wooden planks of a Viking Longhouse, flickering as if the fire inside were gently waving at me to come in. And so, I did. When I stepped inside the Longhouse, the first thing I noticed was the heat. Not overwhelming, just the kind that makes your shoulders relax about 2 inches lower immediately. Several long benches surrounded a great central fire pit, where flames licked up around thick logs that looked like they'd been burning since the previous century, and might keep going a bit longer if no one bothered them. People were gathered around the fire. Vikings, though not quite the helmet-wearing, movie-style ones. These looked more like real people with wind-chapped cheeks, layered woolen tunics, and the kind of hair that suggested they regularly battled both the elements and the concept of combs. Someone handed me a wooden cup with something hot inside, maybe a broth or a mulled ale. I didn't ask, partly because I didn't want to appear rude, and partly because I wasn't entirely sure I wanted the answer. Vikings were very creative with their drinks. I warmed my hands over the fire instead, letting the heat soak in. Every now and then a spark would jump and drift upward toward the smoke hole in the roof, spiraling like a lazy firefly before dissolving into the rafters. A man beside me, broad-shouldered with a beard that probably had its own personality, gently nudged me and offered a turnip. A whole one. Just a turnip. As if this were the universal gesture of hospitality, which in a Viking Longhouse, I suppose it might have been. I thanked him with what I hoped was the correct tone of gratitude. Then I simply held the turnip. I didn't eat it. Not because I disliked turnips, but because it felt like the kind of turnip meant for ceremonial admiration rather than consumption. Also, it was raw and slightly cold. The man nodded at me, satisfied, as though I had passed a test I didn't realize I was taking. Around us, villagers were preparing for the solstice. A woman braided straw ornaments to hang from the beams, humming something old, very old. A tune that probably existed before written language. A child crawled under a bench, chasing a small, shaggy dog that absolutely knew it was being chased and absolutely loved every second of it. The fire crackled. Someone adjusted a shield on the wall. A kettle hissed. The Longhouse felt alive, warm, ancient, and just a little smoky in a comforting way, like a memory you haven't had yet. I watched the fire, and the fire watched me back with that slow, flickering patience flames always seem to have. And for a moment, I drifted, thinking about how winter celebrations existed long before electricity, or calendars, or even pockets to put turnips in. Not that I was planning to pocket the turnip. That would have felt suspicious. And then someone opened the Longhouse door, letting in a gust of cold air and a swirl of snow that danced along the floorboards before disappearing under the benches like shy spirits. It was shaping up to be a very cozy night. I stayed there by the fire for a while, letting my hands warm up slowly. Not too fast, the way you warm a cold spoon before putting it into honey. If you rush it, everything feels a little startled, and I didn't want to startle the fire. Fires, I've noticed, enjoy being approached like shy animals. One gentle hand, then the other. A soft hello. Someone walked behind me carrying a bundle of dried herbs tied with twine. They gave off a mild, earthy smell, something between pine, mint, and the inside of a very clean barn. The herbs were tossed into a clay bowl sitting near the fire, and the smoke changed almost immediately. Richer, fuller, like it had decided to dress up for the winter solstice. A girl sat near the opposite bench, poking at a wooden toy carved into the shape of a horse. The horse had only 3 legs. One had apparently broken off at some point, but she didn't seem to mind. She made the little thing gallop in circles on the floorboards anyway, tapping it lightly so it made a soft clop, 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 and then a thunk where the missing leg would have been. I admired her commitment to the performance. Off to my right, one of the men was cleaning a shield. Not polishing it exactly. More like brushing off bits of hay that had gotten stuck to it. I suppose shields and hay had a very complicated relationship back then. He would brush, pause, inspect, brush again, and then turn the shield to catch the firelight as though waiting for it to wink back at him. I took another look at the turnip in my hand. It was surprisingly smooth, with a faint purple top fading into creamy white. A good, solid, stoic sort of vegetable. The kind you could tell a story to and it would listen with great seriousness, even though it wouldn't understand a word. I rested it in my lap so I could rub my hands again. The fire popped loudly, sending up a tiny spark that danced toward the rafters. The crackle made a woman 2 seats down glance up. She smiled and said something in Old Norse. Something that sounded warm, friendly, and entirely incomprehensible to me. I nodded anyway. Nodding, I've found, is the universal way to say, I appreciate the intention behind whatever you just said. At some point, the Longhouse began to feel almost alive in that winter evening way. The posts shifting slightly with the temperature, the thatched roof settling, the fire sighing as if it were a sleepy relative trying to stay awake for the festivities. Someone began hanging small carved wooden discs along one of the beams. Each one had a little design etched into it. Spirals, knots, suns, animals. I thought one of them might have been a goat, but it could have also been a particularly confident dog. Either way, it had horns. Or ears. Hard to tell from across the room. And then, from outside, there was a brief shout. Not alarming, just an announcement sort of shout. Something about snowdrifts, or the wind shifting, or maybe that someone's goat had wandered off again. There were a lot of goats in this period of history. Goats were basically the neighborhood children. The door opened for a moment, letting in a puff of crisp night air and a swirl of snowflakes that danced across the warm floorboards before melting into tiny, shimmering droplets. The girl with the 3-legged horse held it up as though introducing it to the snowfall. Maybe she was. Winter solstice celebrations had begun, not loudly, not suddenly, but in that slow, unfolding way, like a quilt settling over a room, and I felt myself settling with it. The Longhouse seemed to grow warmer the longer I sat there, as though it were slowly baking everyone inside to a pleasant, drowsy golden brown. The fire crackled, the herbs smoldered, people murmured in low voices, and the girl with the 3-legged horse had now begun staging an entire dramatic production involving a straw doll and what I think might have been a very small wooden boat. I was just about to take another look at the turnip. I liked checking on it from time to time, the way someone might glance at a quiet friend during a party to make sure they're still enjoying themselves. When the Longhouse door swung open, in walked a goat, a very determined goat. It marched across the floor as though late for an important appointment, its little hooves clacking confidently on the boards. No one looked surprised. In fact, A few people barely even glanced up. I began to suspect the goat might outrank me socially here. The goat stopped in front of me, stared for a long moment, and then sneezed. A rather delicate sneeze, actually, for an animal that had just barged in with the swagger of a small Viking warlord. A man across the hall said something that sounded like, "Oh good," Hilda found her way back again. Or perhaps it was, "We should really fix that loose plank in the wall." Old Norse can be tricky. The goat sniffed my turnip. Then it sniffed my cloak. Then it sniffed my knee, which I wasn't expecting and wasn't entirely sure how to respond to politely. I tried a small nod of acknowledgement, but goats don't seem to use nodding as a communication system. She eventually wandered off, apparently satisfied that I was either harmless or irrelevant. Both seemed equally likely. Someone tossed a handful of dried berries into the fire, and they hissed with a tiny burst of sweetness. A man beside me explained, or maybe implied through enthusiastic gestures, that it was part of the solstice tradition, something about encouraging the sun to return. I nodded again, a universal tool I continue to rely on heavily during historical travel. The goat, now circling the benches like an inspector, paused near the shield cleaning man. She gave the shield a long, thoughtful stare, then lightly but decisively head-butted it. Just once. A comment, perhaps. A critique. The man sighed and adjusted the shield again as though this were a regular part of his day. The room smelled of wood smoke, wool and warm bodies. The cozy, lived-in kind of scent that isn't unpleasant at all, just ancient, familiar. A smell shared by 1,000 winters, a smell of survival. Someone began humming a low, steady tune. One of those melodies that doesn't have a clear beginning or end, but feels like it might have been humming along even before people gathered here. A few others joined in, quietly, like snow drifting onto a roof. And then the goat bleated loudly in the middle of the song. Not off-key exactly, but certainly interpretive. Several people chuckled softly. Even the girl's three-legged horse paused its galloping for a moment. The fire popped again. The shadows danced. Everything felt slow and warm and soft at the edges, like the world had put on a well-worn wool blanket. And so, without thinking much about it, I adjusted the turnip on my lap and settled in, feeling completely unhurried. Winter Solstice wasn't meant for hurrying. It was meant for moments like this, and for goats with very strong opinions. The goat eventually settled down beside me, folding her legs neatly beneath her like a small, judgmental cat wearing horns. Every so often she glanced toward the fire, as if deciding whether it deserved her approval. I realized, with some embarrassment, that I was doing the same thing. It really was a very good fire. Someone tossed another handful of herbs onto the flames, and the smoke shifted again, this time curling upward in slow spirals that looked almost deliberate. I leaned slightly to watch. Not too close. Just enough to see the shapes forming in the warm haze above us. One of the older women across the fire noticed me watching and smiled knowingly. She had the kind of smile that suggests she's seen many winters, many fires, and many wide-eyed travelers who don't quite understand what's going on, but are trying their best. She murmured something and motioned gently toward the smoke. I think she was saying, "The smoke always tells a story if you're patient." But she also might have been saying, "The goat belongs to no one. Do not attempt to pet her." Both seemed wise. So I watched the smoke. At first it was just smoke. Gray, swirling, behaving normally. But then, as the flame settled into a quieter rhythm, the patterns began to take on shapes that felt almost familiar. A curve like a coastline, a twist like drifting snow, a ripple like waves brushing the side of a longship. I blinked slowly. It didn't go away. It was like watching old memories that didn't belong to me. Or maybe belonged to the Longhouse itself. I suppose places this old gather memories like dust. Only instead of sneezing, They store them in the rafters. A young man with braids down to his elbows sat on the opposite bench carving something. A small fish, I think. Every few minutes he would glance up at the smoke too, nodding to himself as though it were telling a story he already knew, but didn't mind hearing again. The kind of story best heard for the 100th time during winter. To my left, someone adjusted a rack of drying fish. The wooden beams creaked softly overhead, like they were clearing their throats. A pot rattled on a hook as its contents came to a gentle simmer. The whole longhouse felt like it was slowly rearranging itself around the night, the way people shift under a shared blanket until everyone finds a comfortable angle. The smoke shifted again, and for a moment I thought I saw the shape of a sun. A low winter sun, the kind that barely clears the horizon in these northern places. Warm but distant, patient but shy. And then the goat bleated loudly, startling both me and the vision away. I looked at her. She looked at me. I'm fairly sure her expression said, "Do not get dramatic." Fair enough. The man cleaning the shield earlier now rose to hang it on a peg near the fire. The polished metal caught the light just right, sending a small glint across the longhouse, like a wink from an old friend. The little girl with the three-legged horse tried to catch the sparkle with her toy, tapping its nose against the spot where the light had appeared. Someone began passing around a bowl of dried berries and roasted nuts. When it reached me, I took one piece, something that looked like a cross between a raisin and an enthusiastic pebble. I chewed it politely. It tasted faintly sweet, faintly smoky, and faintly like something you'd only appreciate during a Viking winter. Outside, the wind whistled softly through the gaps in the timber. Not a lonely sound, more like wind checking in, saying, "Yes, yes, I'm still here. I'll wait outside. Carry on." The goat flicked her ear as if acknowledging the wind's announcement. And then the smoke shifted again, slower this time, curling into something like a path. A wandering path. The kind that doesn't lead somewhere so much as it invites you to walk anyway. I breathed in the warm longhouse air and let the shapes drift. Winter Solstice had stories of its own, and sometimes it told them in smoke. After a while, the smell in the longhouse began to change. Subtly, like a quiet announcement from the rafters that something was happening in the cooking corner. Not a full feast yet. More like the early hints of one. The kind of smell that says, "Yes, we're working on it. Please be patient." A woman passed by carrying an iron pot, steam curling out of it in lazy, milky ribbons. She lifted the lid just enough for a few curious onlookers to peek inside, and I caught a glimpse of something thick and bubbling. Maybe stew, maybe porridge. Maybe a combination of both that Vikings politely called stew, but everyone knew was just porridge hoping to reinvent itself. The goat perked up immediately. Apparently, she was a connoisseur. The girl with the three-legged horse paused her play long enough to wander over and inspect the pot as well. She inhaled dramatically, then nodded with great seriousness, as if giving the dish her official approval. The cook laughed, ruffled her hair, and carried the pot onward to its place near the coals. I adjusted the turnip on my lap. It felt somehow heavier now, as though absorbing the gravity of the upcoming meal. Or maybe it had just warmed up from the fire. Hard to say with turnips. They don't communicate much. Across from me, someone was arranging wooden bowls and spoons along a long table. The bowls were all slightly uneven, hand-carved things, each with its own little quirks. One had a knot in the side that looked a bit like a face. A very surprised face. I found myself staring at it longer than I meant to. The face knot seemed to be saying, "This is all rather exciting, isn't it?" And honestly, it was. Someone else pounded dough on a board. A thick, grainy dough that thudded in a rhythmic way, almost musical. Every few thuds, the person would dust their hands with flour, sending small clouds into the air that drifted like tiny snowstorms performing a very tiny ballet. A man at one corner of the room was seasoning a piece of meat with a handful of herbs. He sprinkled them thoughtfully, the way an artist might add the last few brush strokes to a painting. Then he sneezed loudly, really loudly, which sent a few of the herbs flying away into the shadows. He stared at the missing herbs for a moment, shrugged, and continued. Cooking in the Viking Age seemed to involve a lot of shrugging. Meanwhile, the goat had discovered an unattended basket of dried grass and was investigating it with suspicious enthusiasm. A woman gently shooed her away, but the goat only moved 3 steps before turning around and giving the basket another stern look, as if promising to return later for a more thorough examination. For a moment, I wondered if my turnip might be contributing to the growing sense of culinary activity. Maybe it was symbolically part of the feast, even if I wasn't supposed to eat it. Maybe it was like a guest of honor, a vegetable ambassador, or maybe I was giving too much thought to a turnip. The fire crackled again, sending up a spray of sparks that twirled like golden insects before fading into the warm air. A few people murmured blessings under their breath, quiet, ancient phrases meant to honor the sun at its lowest point, coaxing it back toward longer days. One man traced a symbol in the air with his fingertip as he watched the sparks rise. A spiral, I think. Spirals seemed important here. They showed up in carvings, jewelry, even in the way people braided their hair. The goat sneezed again. She had strong opinions about everything tonight. And through all the bustling, shuffling, cooking, and quiet anticipation, the Longhouse kept its gentle rhythm. Warm, steady, ancient. Winter was at its deepest, and somehow the world felt full. The feast preparations continued around me in a kind of quiet choreography. Not rushed, not chaotic, just people moving with the gentle confidence of those who have done this 100 winters before and plan to do it 100 winters more. I shifted a bit on the bench, the turnip settling into a new, more contemplative position in my hand. It seemed to be observing the room now, maybe taking notes. I wasn't sure. A man with a long, braided beard sat down beside me, exhaling deeply as if he'd just completed a quest of great importance. Then he turned and said something in Old Norse that sounded like, "The snow is good this year." Or possibly, "My boots have finally dried." Or, and this felt just as likely, "Do you have any idea where that goat went?" I nodded politely because nodding is still my most reliable historical tool. He scratched his beard, looked at my turnip, then looked at me, raising his eyebrows as though expecting me to explain my possession of such an object. I simply held the turnip up for him to see. He nodded in return, a very solemn nod, as if acknowledging a shared truth of the universe. That was the entire conversation. Perfectly complete. A masterpiece of mutual understanding. Across the room, a boy was trying to stack wooden cups into a tall tower. It wasn't going well. The cups kept falling over, which caused him to sigh dramatically and begin again. After several attempts, he looked at me with the expression of someone who felt betrayed by gravity. I gave him a small, encouraging smile. He nodded, a tiny nod, and resumed his architectural work. A woman near the hearth began singing a slow, deep melody, her voice warm as embers. It wasn't a song with verses or structure, more like a sound the fire itself might make if it wanted to hum. A few people joined in at different moments, like drifting echoes. The Longhouse shifted with the music. Not literally, but in the atmosphere, the warmth, the way the shadows moved. Even the rafters seemed to lean closer, listening. The goat wandered back into view again, brushing her side against the bench like she owned the place. She stopped in front of the boy with the wooden cups, stared at his tower in progress, and gently knocked it over with her nose. Then she walked away. The boy let out a slow exhale. He didn't look angry, more resigned, as though accepting that goats, like Winter, simply do what they want. Someone at the far end of the Longhouse clapped twice. Not loudly, just enough to draw attention. A few people turned their heads. For a moment, I thought something significant was about to happen. But then, nothing happened. It was just two claps. Perhaps the person liked the acoustics. Hard to say. I realized then how deeply soothing it all was. The soft crackling, the low music, the clatter of bowls, the occasional goat-related interruption, the steady warmth pressing gently into my hands. It was a room full of people, but the quiet was the kind that made you feel accompanied rather than crowded. The bearded man beside me finally spoke again. He pointed to the fire, then to the ceiling and said something thoughtful sounding, maybe a proverb, maybe weather commentary, maybe instructions for finding a missing goat in the snow. I nodded in profound agreement. He nodded back, even more profoundly. That was the second entire conversation we had. Honestly, one of the best talks I've ever had. The Longhouse had settled into that deep, humming kind of quiet that isn't really silence at all. More like a collection of soft sounds stacked gently on top of each other. The crackle of the fire, the faint clink of a wooden spoon against a bowl, someone's low humming drifting in and out like a lazy thread of wind, the occasional, inevitable goat noise. I shifted a little on the bench, feeling the steady warmth soak into my legs. The turnip, still loyally present, now rested against my knee as though it had decided to stay for the whole evening. I gave it a small, absent-minded pat. It had earned that. A group of people sat near the far end of the hall, speaking in low tones. Their faces were serious, but not worried. More like people discussing something big in a calm way. I caught a few words here and there. Sun, darkness, return, year. Even without understanding all the language, I knew what they were talking about. Winter Solstice is the point where the sun steps back as far as it can, and then hesitates, and then, finally, starts to inch forward again. Someone stood up. An older man with a fur-lined cloak and a staff so worn it looked like it had heard every story twice. He walked slowly toward the fire, and as he moved, the murmur in the Longhouse faded. He didn't shout, he didn't make a big announcement, he simply stood by the flames and began to speak. His voice was low, the kind that you lean in to hear even if you're already close. He spoke of winters past, of snow so deep it nearly swallowed the houses, of storms that rattled the doors like impatient giants. But he also spoke of the sun, always, always returning. He pointed upward toward the smoke hole, where the faint outline of cold night sky peeked through. A few children tilted their heads back, following his gesture, as if they might catch the sun sneaking a look at them from just beyond the darkness. The goat, having positioned herself at a dignified distance, watched too. Goats are very interested in cosmic matters, it seems. As he spoke, someone added another log to the fire. The flames leapt higher, painting the beams above with gold. The Longhouse seemed to breathe in and then out, the way people do when a story touches something old inside them. He talked about how this night was a hinge, the turning point between the deep dark and the long climb back to light, about how people had marked this turning for as long as anyone could remember, not just with feasts and songs, but with stubborn hope. One of the women near the hearth traced a simple sun symbol on the floor with her fingertip, just in the dust and ash. A child beside her copied the motion, making their own little uneven sun. You could tell which one belonged to which person, but both were sincere. The older man finally lifted one hand, palm open toward the fire, and let the words taper into a kind of quiet blessing that didn't need translation. You could feel it more than understand it. May the sun return. May the cold soften. May we all make it through to the other side of winter. People bowed their heads for a moment. Not dramatically. Just that small tilt that says, I hear you. I agree. I hope for that too. The fire crackled in response, and a stray spark drifted lazily upward like a tiny messenger carrying the wish into the dark. The goat sneezed, which might have ruined the solemnity a little, but honestly, it just made the whole thing feel more human. I looked at the faces around the longhouse. Lined, young, tired, amused. People who had seen many winters, and others who had only seen a handful. All gathered around the same fire, under the same roof, on the same long night, waiting for the same returning light. The turnip, for its part, remained very neutral about the whole thing, and I let myself sink a little deeper into the warmth, listening as the quiet slowly filled back up with soft talk and movement. The hinge of the year had turned, even if we couldn't see it yet. Sometimes the most important changes are the ones you only feel. The elder's story drifted into a natural pause, the kind of quiet that settles into a room like snow on a rooftop. Not heavy, not dramatic, just soft. The fire cracked once like it was clearing its throat, and a few people shifted on the benches. I was still holding the turnip, though now I was holding it with the deep seriousness of someone who had forgotten they were holding anything at all. It felt strangely warm, as if it had been listening to the story too. Then the goat trotted back into the center of the longhouse. Not barged this time. Trotted. With purpose. Like someone with a message. She stopped in front of the fire, looked at the elder, looked at the flames, then looked at the audience. And then, with impeccable timing, she bleated exactly once. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was declarative. A small boy gasped as if the goat had just announced the results of a royal council meeting. A few people chuckled under their breath. The elder looked down at her with a kind of patient amusement, the way someone looks at a beloved but stubborn family member who has strong opinions about soup. He said something to her in Old Norse, probably something like, "Yes, Hilda, thank you. We're all aware the sun will return." Or maybe, "No, you may not eat the ceremonial wreath this year." Hard to know with goats. The goat blinked once, very slowly, and then turned around and walked directly toward me. Not threatening, not curious, not mischievous, just purposeful. She stopped right in front of me and stared at the turnip in my hands. Not at me, not at my cloak, not at my pocket watch. At the turnip. I froze, unsure if I was about to be judged, blessed, or robbed. I held the turnip a little closer to my chest, gently, not defensively. The goat leaned in and sniffed it with the seriousness of a scholar examining an artifact from a lost civilization. Then she made a small noise that sounded like a hum of approval, or disapproval, or perhaps something in between, like a thoughtful, She then nudged my knee very lightly with her nose, just once. Then turned and wandered away again, her work apparently done. A young woman sitting 2 seats down laughed softly, covering her mouth with her hand. She said something kind and teasing in Old Norse, tapping her own knee in imitation of the goat's gesture. I shrugged good-naturedly. It's surprisingly easy to shrug in Old Norse. Across the hall, someone tossed another herb bundle into the fire. The flames leapt up, bright and lively, sending shadows dancing along the curved beams overhead. The smoke drifted upward in slow spirals again, this time forming shapes that looked a bit like pathways disappearing into forests. The elder continued speaking, but now in a softer tone, almost conversational. Even without understanding the words, I could feel the meaning of them settling into the room. How winter tests you, how fire gathers you, how hope grows slowly, spark by spark. The goat settled beside the fire, folding her legs neatly beneath her like a furry philosophical companion. She looked perfectly content, like someone who had delivered her one important message for the night and was now off duty. The turnip continued resting in my hands, warm and oddly comforting. I thought, not for the first time, how strange and lovely these quiet moments in history could be. The ones that seem small but linger in your memory, like soft embers long after the fire burns down. Some nights aren't meant to be grand. They're meant to be gentle, and sometimes they involve a goat who just needs you to understand something, even if you never quite figure out what it was. The longhouse settled into an even deeper warmth. Not hotter, just fuller. Like the fire had expanded inward somehow, filling the space between people, softening the corners of the night. Someone added another log to the fire, and the flames leaned upward, stretching like a waking cat. The smoke drifted lazily toward the roof opening, curling in slow ribbons. Even the shadows seemed to sway a little, relaxed by the heat. The goat had decided that her work was done and now lounged beside the fire like a furry philosopher contemplating the nature of warmth. Every so often she shifted, nudging the ashes with her hoof as if giving editorial feedback to the fire. I adjusted the turnip in my hands, not because it needed adjusting, but because it felt strange not to. It had become a sort of companion at this point. A quiet one, admittedly, but a loyal supporter throughout the evening. A young man settled onto the bench beside me. He smelled faintly of pine smoke and cold air, the way someone smells after returning from outside. He nodded once, greeting me with a universal gesture of shared fire. Then he gestured toward my turnip, raising his eyebrows in a way that clearly meant, "Is that turnip particularly important?" I shook my head, then shrugged, which combined roughly translated to, "I don't know how this happened either, but we're both committed now." He chuckled and patted my shoulder, a friendly, slightly amused pat, and then settled back, stretching his legs out with a long exhale. He looked like someone who had spent the day doing actual heavy work, unlike me, who had spent the day holding a turnip and occasionally nodding. Across the longhouse, a group of older women began murmuring to one another, passing a bowl of carved wooden tokens between them. Each token had a small etched symbol: spirals, animals, suns, snowflakes. I couldn't tell if they were used for divination or games or simply decoration. One of the women glanced up at me and smiled, offering the bowl with a gentle tilt. I reached out, but before I could choose a token, the goat got up, trotted over, and placed herself directly between me and the bowl, staring up with a look that clearly said, "Absolutely not. You've already got the turnip. Don't get greedy." The whole group laughed. Even I laughed. It was hard not to. The woman withdrew the bowl with a playful shake of her head, as though acknowledging that the goat had made an official ruling. I leaned back slightly, amused by how this goat seemed to have more authority than some historical kings. She returned to her spot by the fire, only after confirming, with great seriousness, that I was still holding the turnip she had approved earlier. The elder resumed speaking again, his voice lower now, softer, like embers settling. He told a story, or perhaps a memory, about a winter long ago when the snow piled against the door so high the longhouse felt like a ship trapped in ice. People had passed the time-carving ornaments, sharing food and telling stories until the world thawed. Even without knowing the language, I felt the shape of it. That slow, stubborn, communal warmth that keeps people going when the world goes cold. A few children leaned against their parents, half asleep. Someone wrapped a wool blanket around their shoulders. A pot simmered quietly on the far side of the room, releasing tiny puffs of fragrant steam. And for a moment, just a little moment, everything felt still. Still in the way snow is still. Still in the way old stories are still. Still in that deep winter night way, where time softens, the fire hums, and the world feels held in place by warmth. I closed my eyes for a breath, letting the sounds wrap around me, the crackle of the fire, the soft murmur of voices, the rhythmic breathing of the goat, the quiet rustle of blankets. It was not grand, it was not dramatic, it was gentle. And I felt myself sinking into that gentleness, letting it find all the cold corners inside me and warm them, one slow ember at a time. The longhouse grew even quieter as the night stretched onward. The kind of quiet that isn't empty at all, but full of breath, full of warmth, full of the soft togetherness that winter seems to coax out of people. The kind of quiet that feels like a blanket draped gently across a whole room. The elder finished his final story with a slow exhale, letting the last few sparks of meaning drift through the air like dust caught in firelight. People nodded to one another, murmuring good wishes. Words I didn't know, but I understood them anyway. Winter languages have a way of translating themselves through tone alone. The goat stood, stretched her legs with the drama of someone who had worked very hard this evening and made her way over to me one last time. She touched her nose to the turnip, a brief ceremonial tap, then looked at me with what could only be described as contented approval, as if to say, "You did well with this turnip," which honestly, I hadn't done anything, but it's nice to be acknowledged. People began settling themselves for the night, pulling blankets over their shoulders, rearranging furs, finding comfortable spots along the benches or near the fire. A few children slept already, small and bundled like little winter cocoons. Someone handed me a blanket, thick, woolen, smelling faintly of smoke and spruce. I wrapped it around myself, feeling the warmth sink in immediately. The kind of warmth that doesn't just sit on your skin, but seems to reach you from the inside out. The elder approached me, speaking gently. I couldn't understand his words, but he smiled in a way that made the meaning clear enough. Rest. The night is long, and the sun will return in its own time. He touched the side of his hand to his forehead, then gestured toward the fire. I mirrored the gesture, hoping I hadn't just told him something wildly inappropriate in Old Norse. He chuckled, which I took as a good sign. The goat circled twice and settled beside me again, folding her legs neatly underneath her. Apparently, we were now officially companions for the evening. She let out a quiet huff, like a sigh of satisfaction, and rested her head close to my knee. It was oddly comforting. I let my eyes drift closed for a few moments. The fire cracked softly. Someone shifted on a bench. The wind pressed faintly against the wooden walls outside like a giant hand, testing the strength of the longhouse. Time thickened a little, becoming syrupy, unhurried, as though it too was settling in for a winter nap. And somewhere deep in my cloak pocket, barely noticeable at first, the smooth stone I kept with me warmed, just slightly. Not the full hum, not the bright glow, just that soft, early stirring, the one that whispered, "Soon. Not now. Not this moment, but soon." I opened my eyes again, letting the room drift back into focus. The goat shifted just enough to thump her head gently against my knee as if checking that I was still upright. I whispered a quiet promise. "I'll stay a little longer." Whether she understood or not, she gave a slow blink that looked suspiciously like approval. The fire dimmed, the voices stilled, and the longhouse settled into a gentle, collective breath, a winter lullaby older than any of the stories shared tonight. Some nights aren't loud. Some nights aren't grand. Some nights are just soft places to rest for a while. And this was one of those nights. I closed my eyes again, letting the warmth gather around me like a cloak within a cloak. And when the stone finally hummed, later, much later, it felt like it was simply reminding me that even gentle nights must end, but not before I drifted just a little further into the quiet.